For over 40 years, the Assad family ruled Syria with an iron fist, a regime built on fear, manipulation, and violence. But as the world shifted, so did the ground beneath their feet. What once seemed like an unbreakable dynasty crumbled, not through a foreign invasion or a single act of defiance, but through the very system of control that they had perfected. The collapse of the Assads wasn't just the fall of a family, it was the unravelling of a machine that had kept the country in line for generations. And in the end, when the violence they used to stay in power turned against them, Bashar al-Assad fled to Russia. The question is, how did we get here? And what does the fall of one regime mean for the future of the Middle East? This is the story of the Assad's downfall, a story of power, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of control, and how the collapse reshaped the region in ways we still don't fully understand. It was a cold November morning in 1983 when a deafening explosion rocked the US Marine barracks in Beirut. 241 American servicemen were killed in an attack that would change the course of modern warfare. This was no random act of violence, it was a birth of a new weapon, the suicide bomber. It was devastating, precise, and impossible to defend against.
He looked white. The dust had just covered him.
But the roots of this moment had been nurtured long before in the shadowy corridors of power in Damascus, where Hafez al-Assad was quietly sculpting a new way to wield influence in the Middle East. Hafez al-Assad was a master of power, but not in the conventional sense. To him, Syria was not a nation to be governed, but a machine to be controlled. Assad's ascent in 1970 after a military coup was just the beginning of his ruthless reign. Syria's fractured society, divided along sectarian, ideological, and regional lines, became the gears of his machine, and every cog, every lever, was manipulated with an iron fist. His regime was defined by terror, not only to quash dissent but to project strength through Syria's borders. In 1982, the Syrian government brutally crushed an uprising by the Muslim Brotherhood in the city of Hama. Whole neighbourhoods were obliterated, the death toll remains uncertain, but estimates range from 10,000 to 40,000. This wasn't just a crackdown, it was a message. To rebel was to perish. But Assad's genius lay in understanding that terror didn't need to be confined to his borders, he could export it. By building covert alliances with groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Assad used radical forces as his proxies, shadowy operatives to further Syria's interests while he avoided direct responsibility. The 1983 Beirut bombing was the pinnacle of Assad's new strategy. Though Hezbollah had carried out the attack, the operation bore the unmistakable fingerprints of Syrian influence. This was a deliberate act of asymmetry, designed to undermine American resolve in the region. The message was clear. Power didn't have to come from conventional warfare, it could come from terror, from the ability to strike at the heart of your enemy and disappear into the shadows. The strategy worked. The United States pulled its force from Lebanon, marking a victory not just for Hezbollah, but for Assad's vision of asymmetric warfare. The suicide bomber, once an act of desperation, had become a weapon of choice, one that would resonate through the Middle East for decades to come. But there was an irony in this victory, one that even Assad couldn't have predicted. The very tactics he had pioneered would, in time, turn against him.
Damascus, Syria, June 11, 2000. President Hafez al-Assad, also known as the Lion of Damascus, has just died. The eyes of the world are upon a gawky young man devoid of charisma, Bashar al-Assad, the emblem of a nation in mourning.
When Hafez al-Assad passed away in 2000, his son Bashar took power, a reluctant heir. A London-trained ophthalmologist with little experience in the brutal realities of the regime. Bashar seemed like an unlikely candidate to inherit his father's empire. Initially, his presidency was marked by cautious optimism. There were whispers of reforms and modernization, a promise of greater openness. For a moment, Syria seemed poised for change. But beneath the surface, the old machinery of power remained intact. The Mukhabarat, Syria's secret police, continued its work, suppressing any form of dissent. the political systems once painted with the hopes of reform quickly returned to the brutal playbook of Assad Sr. And, in the shadows, Syria's ties to Hezbollah and other radical factions only deepened. In 2011, the Arab Spring began as a spark of hope across the Middle East, igniting flames of revolution and the promise of democracy. Dictators who had ruled for decades from Tunisia to Egypt to Libya saw their reigns toppled by the masses demanding change. It was a time of optimism, an optimism that reached Syria, where people took to the streets calling for freedom, dignity, and an end to corruption. The world watched, cautiously hopeful that Bashar al-Assad, who had promised reforms in the early days of his presidency, would seize this opportunity to evolve his regime. But Bashar, unlike his father Hafez, lacked the subtlety and calculated ruthlessness that had defined his family's rule. Instead of adapting, he turned to the only tool he knew: violence.
The way to drive out people is to eliminate them the same way your father did.
In being independent, yes. In fighting terrorism, yes. In defending the Syrian people and the country, yes.
Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father, had mastered the art of control through fear. He built a system that operated on terror, an authoritarian structure that held Syria together with brutal efficiency. But Bashar, through inheriting this structure, did not possess his father's sharp political instincts. Instead of manipulating the system, he relied on raw force. And so, when the Arab Spring reached Syria, Bashar responded with brutality, sending tanks into cities, bombing opposition strongholds, and gunning down protesters in the streets. His response fractured the nation. What began as a peaceful uprising quickly morphed into a vicious civil war, splintering the opposition into factions, some fighting for democracy, others turning to extremism. In this vacuum stepped groups like Al-Qaeda and later ISIS, exploiting the chaos that Bashar had helped create. In 2015, Syria had become a global battleground. As ISIS advanced, Russia entered the fray, not just to fight the extremists, but to prop up Bashar al-Assad's crumbling regime. Russia's intervention was calculated. Vladimir Putin, a man who understood power as a function of control, knew that keeping Syria under Assad's grip was vital to Russian influence in the Middle East. Russian warplanes soared across the skies, bombing not just ISIS, but any group that threatened Assad's regime. With Russia's air support, Iran's militias and Hezbollah forces all fighting on Assad's behalf, it seemed as though the regime might survive after all. But in a strange, surreal turn, Russia began to frame this war not just as a geopolitical struggle, but as an exercise in cultural dominance. Amidst the ruins of Palmyra, once a world-famous ancient city now reduced to rubble by both ISIS and Syrian forces, Russia staged an unlikely event, an orchestral performance. In 2016, famed conductor Valery Gergiev and the Mariinsky Orchestra performed in Palmyra's ruins, sending a message to the world. Russia was not just military present, but it was here to reshape the narrative. The devastation of a lost civilization was juxtaposed with the sounds of Russian classical music, a bizarre attempt to restore a semblance of order through culture. This was more than just a performance, it was an assertion of power, a symbolic act that reinforced Russia's narrative as the true restorer of stability in Syria. In the chaos of the war, Russia was presenting itself as the custodian of civilization, yet while Russia played its cultural cards, the war raged on. For a time it seemed Assad's regime would endure, a fortress of violence upheld by fear, corruption and external alliances. But history has an uncomfortable way of catching up with the most brutal systems. By 2023, Russia's war in Ukraine had drained its resources, Iran's influence in the region had eroded, and domestic protests, a reminder of the Arab Spring's once hopeful spark, began to shake the very foundations of Assad's rule. The system, long sustained by manipulation and terror, could no longer suppress the cracks beneath it. Rebel forces, once fragmented and disjointed, began to coalesce, reclaiming territory that had long seemed lost. Then came the inevitable. A new force, once thought sidelined, re-emerged. HTS, Al-Qaeda in Syria, now rebranded, seized the moment with ruthless efficiency. They exploited the chaos left by a fractured regime, their advance unstoppable. What began as scattered protests demanding freedom had now given birth to a violent rebellion. Homs fell, and by 2024, the impossible occurred. Damascus. The heart of Assad's power was breached. The presidential palace, once a symbol of absolute control, was overtaken. For the first time in over 50 years, the Assad dynasty, built on terror, violence, and manipulation, had crumbled. Bashar al-Assad, once thought untouchable, fled to Moscow, abandoning his capital to the advancing rebels. The curtain had fallen. The Assad dynasty, after more than 5 decades, was no more. The collapse of Syria is not just the fall of one man or one family, it is the disintegration of an entire system, a regime founded on manipulation and fear. Hafez al-Assad, who once believed that power could only be sustained through the orchestration of terror, had shaped a world in which violence became the only language. His methods were perfected over time, and by the time his son took control, they were a well-worn path. But terror, like all systems, has a cost, and that cost is paid in the very destruction of the system itself. Now Syria stands amid the rubble of its past. One question lingers: can a nation forged in fear ever heal? Or will it be condemned to forever relive the ghosts of its rulers, their violent legacy, and their terror-fueled control, echoing through every fragment of the present? In Iraq, the removal of Saddam Hussein led to anarchy. In Libya, Gaddafi's fall led to a power vacuum spiralling into decades of conflict. Now, Syria faces its own chaotic crossroads. The rebel forces led by HTS and others may have won the battle, but will they be able to win the peace? Will they unite to rebuild the country, or will fractured ideologies and competing ambitions tear it apart further? The story of Syria is not just about one regime, but a lesson about the dangerous allure of power built on fear. It is the story of how terror becomes a language of control, how it reshapes not just a nation, but an entire region. But even the most brutal systems eventually collapse under their own weight, and the consequences of this collapse ripple far beyond the borders of Syria. The violence that Assad unleashed in his pursuit of power, extremism, sectarianism, the weaponization of terror, has now become a regional contagion. The fall of the Assads is not merely the end of one family's rule, it is the unravelling of an entire system, one built on manipulation, violence, and fear, that has reverberated through the Middle East. The rebels' victory may seem like the dawn of a new era, but the forces that have shaped this violence for so long cannot simply be erased, and as Syria stands on the precipice of a new chapter, one question remains: will it ever escape the shadows of its past?